Obiagendi, Dun Singitomo, Boatsamo. Good afternoon. Though we are not gathered in one place, we would like to acknowledge that we live and work on the Tewa homelands of people who were here long before we called this place New Mexico. We're still here at Ohkay White Shawl Water Place. We honor their sacrifices and contributions they have granted each of us to be here today. Thank you, Kuntawa. Thank you for joining us. Bipawabe, welcome. Welcome to our virtual speaker series, Indigenous Storytelling in Literature and Arts. My name is Dr. Matthew Martinez. I'm currently the Deputy Director at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe. During these COVID times, our museum continues to work with New Mexico schools and teachers to support student learning and also to be a resource for those continue to learn in their particular classroom forums. Our exhibits and programs provide a lens to sharing the histories and contributions of Southwest Indigenous peoples. We're often asked about books and resources that teachers can include in their classroom materials. This series is aimed at sharing some of these perspectives from Indigenous scholars and authors. We're excited to host speakers and presenters to share their own experiences and talk about their contributions to the field of literature and the arts. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hosting the series and sharing the word out about resources that our speakers talk about. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lillia McEnaney, who is MIAC's Curatorial Assistant for introductions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Dr. Martinez said, I am a curatorial assistant at the museum. And before we get going on my end, I'd like to acknowledge that as a non-native person living in so-called Santa Fe, I am a guest in Ohkay within the Tewa world. And I am so appreciative of this opportunity to talk with Dr. Reese and Dr. Martinez. So enrolled at Nambé Owingeh, Dr. Debbie Reese's research on Native peoples and children's literature is taught in English, library science, and education classrooms in the United States and Canada. Dr. Reese's education started at the day school in Nambé. She became a teacher and taught at Albuquerque Public School, Ohkay Elementary School, and the Santa Fe Indian School. She has a bachelor's in education from the University of New Mexico, a master's in education from the University of Oklahoma, and a PhD in education from the University of Illinois, not to mention a master's in library and information science from the University of California, San Jose State. She has been selected to deliver prestigious lectures, including the Simon Ortiz and Labriola Center Lecture on Indigenous Land, Culture, and Community, and the American Library Association's May Hill Arbuthnot Lecture. Her blog, American Indians and Children's Literature, is widely recognized as a leading resource for teachers, librarians, parents, writers, and professors. She is the co-adaptor of An Indigenous People of the United States for Young People, which won the honor award from the American Indian Library Association and was on numerous best of book lists in 2019. So thank you, Dr. Reese, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to chat about this really important conversation that's going on right now. So before we get started, to start off, I wanted to ask why and how you got interested in education children's literature. I'm always interested in how the genesis of this work kind of grows. Was there a single aha moment that you can point to, or did it evolve in a different way?
Yeah, there's a moment. I moved to the University of Illinois to Urbana-Champaign in 1993, where I was going to do a PhD in family literacy, because I was doing math and family literacy for the Pueblo during the previous years. And so I wanted to study that and got here and started taking those classes, but also started realizing that the university's mascot was driving a lot of what people thought they knew about Native people. And they would, in graduate student courses, you're asked to introduce yourself and what you want to study. And so I did that. And as soon as I would say that I'm a Native person from Nambé Owingeh, they would like, oh, what do you think of the chief, the mascot? And I'd say, well, it's a stereotype. And that wasn't the answer they wanted. And I'd get phone calls from local clubs. Would I come and dance? And I'd say, no, we don't dance for fun or entertainment. Dance for us is prayer, and it only happens at a certain time of the year in a certain place. And they'd say, well, how about, can you come and tell us a story? And I'm like, no, I'm not a storyteller. I'm a teacher. I will gladly come and talk to you about Native people and about Nambé Pueblo and those sorts of things that I know, because I'm a teacher. I can do that. And they didn't want that. They just say, no, thank you. And that was the end of the conversation. And so I thought, what the heck is wrong with all of these people in the Midwest? So because I was here to study family literacy, that meant studying children's books, because that act of reading between a parent or an adult and a child. So I wanted to study that, and I still wanted to work in children's literature. So I started thinking, okay, what is in children's books that could be driving this embrace of this stereotype? And once I started looking, I noticed just how often what you see in very popular books like the Clifford the Big Red Dog, everybody knows Clifford the Big Red Dog. There's a Halloween issue, and he's dressed up just like Chief Owingeh. The Berenstain Bears, people love that series. And there's a series, one book in the series called Berenstain Bears Go to Camp. And in there you find Grizzly Bob, good old Grizzly Bob, leading a campfire story dressed up just like the mascot. So those are two examples in the kinds of books that parents give to their kids once they buy at Kmart or Walmart. So they're readily available, and they mean a lot because mom or dad or grandma or grandpa bought that book for you and gave it to you. So it's not just a book, it's something that was given to you by someone who cares about you, who loves you. And so these images are rooted in acts of love from people who care for you and who don't know that the images are bad. And so I started looking at how prevalent those images were and how people were attached to those, and saw the connections that were absolutely there between images in a children's book and the fondness of books and the mascot. So I changed the area, the thrust of my research, and started looking at children's books.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, growing up as a non-native person, I remember reading Clifford the Big Red Dog and Bernstein Bears, but I never would have had that experience personally. But it's really interesting. So, I mean, expanding on that, as you see it, how are Indigenous people represented in children's literature and education today? Like, can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm doing a new research project on that. One of the questions that I have is, are we seeing a shift over time? And so I've been trying to create a database, a spreadsheet actually, of all the books that I have studied and written about, and new ones that I find as I'm doing this research. And I see that before the year 2000, we had individual writers doing many different books, and not very many at that. So not a whole lot before 2000. And then and after 2000, I'm seeing a lot more books by Native writers, and they are stories and fiction. What we saw prior to 2000 was a lot of nonfiction, who are the Sioux kinds of books, things like that. So the body of the work seems to be changing, and the number of Native people who are getting published is also changing. So those are two very good things. But I'm going to show you a graphic that captures where we are in 2018. This graphic is done by one of my colleagues, Dr. Sarah Park-Dolan, who is up in Minnesota, and the Cooperative Children's Book Center in Madison, Wisconsin. The center in Madison receives every book that comes out in any given year, and they sort the books and decide whether or not it's got enough content to be called a Native book or an Asian Pacific. As you see, there's the categories here on this graphic. Well, they've been doing this for a long, long time, like 20 or 30 years. So we have data from them that we can track change over time. But so what you see here is in 2018, there were over 3,000 books published. You see that child on the far left is the Native child. 23 books in 2018 had enough content to be called Native books. But when I look at those 23, half of them are by people who are not Native and who are creating stereotypes. So the graphic reflects an idea that a book can be a mirror because it reflects who you are, or it can be a window into somebody else's culture. In this case, it's mirrors, and a white child has lots of mirrors, as you see on the far right. Animals have more mirrors than all the children, Native and children of color on the far left. And a lot of those mirrors are cracked and broken because they're stereotypes. So when you start looking at the data and the quality of the books, the numbers just drop even further. So even though I can say that after the year 2000 there were more, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and so if half of those 23, that's about what, 11 books approximately written by and about Native folks. So, I mean, why, from your perspective, why does this matter? I know a lot of your work really deals with anti-Indigenous stereotypes and misrepresentations. So can you just talk a little bit about the tangible impacts that these stereotypes have, like that mirror effect?
Yeah. There's not a lot. There is some research that talks about the impact that stereotypes have on a child's self-esteem or the child's self-efficacy. This is Stephanie Freiberg's research. She's a psychologist and has done analysis of mascots. And some of her research also looks at images from Disney's Pocahontas and how children, Native young people and non-Native people are impacted as a result of seeing those images. And she has documented that there's a negative effect on Native kids who see those kinds of images. There are other studies that do interviews with Native people about, so how was school and how did it feel and like for you? And kids that drop out, they talk about they just didn't see their own people in their curriculum or in the books, and what they saw instead was stereotypes and bias and misrepresentation and factual errors in history, and especially in history. So when you see yourself characterized as just someone who would massacre white people, or if you see yourself as primitive and savage rather than the factual information about who we were and who we are, diplomats, sovereign nations, that isn't in what kids get. And so it's easy to see why Native kids drop out of school at such high rates. There's nothing there for them. And when you think about this graphic and this white child and how much that white child's history and very existence is reflected in all kinds of stories in the history, you can see pretty clearly why it would be difficult for Native kids to experience success in school.
Absolutely. It's not just a narrative of erasure, but it's a narrative of active harm along with that erasure.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, thinking about all of this, how do you think these ideas can best be combated through the type of work that you do? What tools do we have to really do this work and make a difference?
I think books by Native writers are one of the fundamentally important tools that we all need to have in the classrooms. Part of what you can do when you are working with, let's see if I can do this right now. Yeah, if you're going to use a book like this one, Fall in Line Holden by Daniel Van de Veer, a teacher can hold this book up and they can say, kids are going to read Fall in Line Holden by Daniel Van de Veer. And Daniel is a citizen of the Navajo Nation. And so the teacher is using that present tense verb is, and that pushes right away at the misperceptions that kids have that we no longer exist. And the teacher can also say, let's look at the Navajo Nation's website. And so just a single book, you can bring kids from that long ago past into the present day. So they do the work that's in the book itself, the story that he tells in this book, but the teacher does layers and layers and layers of work with the way she uses the book. So I think kids' books by Native writers are especially important because you can do that. You can say he is or she is, and you can point to their websites, because when the National Museum of the American Indian opened, whatever year that was, I don't know, 15 years ago, people were surprised that Native people were talking on cell phones. I was like, oh my God. That's the picture they had on the newspapers, was a person in a headdress on a cell phone saying they have cell phones. Oh, God. Yeah.
And Daniel is actually going to be part of this series. So we're excited to hear his perspective too on that fabulous book. And I think that's a really interesting point, how an author can be a jumping off point to be, what is the Navajo Nation? What does the government of the Navajo Nation look like, et cetera? So can you talk a little bit about that? You mentioned a few times the importance of using present tense verbs in education when talking about Indigenous people. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Part of what needs to happen is that understanding that we are still here, and it grates every time I say we're still here. It's like, for goodness sake, everyone is walking on Indigenous land, and they think that we vanished, and we didn't. We are still here, and pointing that out with books that push against some of the books by non-native writers at Stereotypes. So there are several children's books about boarding school. That book is, Daniel's book is about boarding school. And they misrepresent what boarding school was to Native people. I think the audience for the series might know that we are sovereign nations and that the government of the United States has had several waves of trying to erase our culture so they could undermine our nation, so they could finally have at the rest of our resources, including our lands. And those stories are in children's books by Native writers. We don't shy away from that. So Daniel's book talks about boarding schools. A lot of people think, oh, we can't really talk about that because that's just too harsh. And it's not. It is history, it is truth, it is fact.
Right, exactly. And so I guess something that I think is really interesting about what you're talking about is we're talking about using books that are written by Native people, right, as a starting point. But on the other end of that, you need an informed teacher, right, who can use that book as a starting off point. And so how do you kind of go about that from the other end? And this might be getting into a conversation about your blog a little bit too.
When I moved to Illinois to work on my degree, I learned how higher education functions and what it means to be working at a Research One university. Basically, you have to do research and you have to publish it in places where other people at Research One universities will read it. And my heart was in education from the start. And though I appreciate what research is about, I also know that that research has to touch the people who it's meant to help. And so I have lots of articles and book chapters in places that a teacher will never be able to access because they can't afford to join the associations that would provide that journal to them. So I started putting stuff on that blog. So it's about 15 years worth of work that is accessible for any teacher, parent, librarian, professor, writer who has any interest at all in the depictions of Native people in children's books. So that comes about too from some of the teachings that I had growing up there at Nambé that I carry with me today. When you get into a Research One university, you're supposed to be all about you and your career, and that's not how I was raised. That's not a value. That is mine. My value is that what I do is not for me, it is for the community, whether that community is the Pueblo itself, or the state currently known as New Mexico, or the country currently known as the United States of America. It's giving what I have to give in an unselfish way. And so that's the blog as a social media platform that was evolving right around the time I was wanting to do that was perfect. It was perfect.
And so are you using the blog kind of to educate non-native teachers? Is that your goal with it? Because that's kind of what it seems like, to kind of get at it from the other way. So you have Native authors producing this amazing content and just bridging that gap between that and the mainstream education system. Is that kind of how you see it working?
Yeah, because partly teachers are well-intentioned. I mean, that's a given. I don't assume bad intent by anybody. Well, there's certainly a huge amount of misinformation that teachers got when they were in school. So for example, everybody loves The Outsiders, right? I mean, that novel, that young adult novel, people really like that. And it's been turned into more than one movie. And when you read that for the Native content, it's there. There's stereotyping about wild Indians that is in the Insiders, and most people don't remember it because nobody ever said, hey, look at page, whatever it was. So I try to bring that forward with the blog, and I say, this is the problem on this page, this is what's wrong with it, and this is why you probably shouldn't use this book anymore, because you are going to be affirming ignorance that your students are bringing into the classroom, and there's no reason to do that. So I'm trying to make that case with teachers that any teacher, a parent trusts their kid's teacher to do right by them. And when a teacher does not carefully review the materials they're using with kids with regard to Native Americans, past or present, the chance that they're going to miseducate is very high. And the chance even more now, this is the cool thing about social media, is that now parents are using social media to talk back to their kids' teachers. And there's a lot of quote unquote shaming going on over on Twitter and on all of the social media platforms. And teachers don't want to be embarrassed or ashamed. Publishers don't like that either when their books get called out. But these are tools that provide people who haven't had that access before to speak back to the power structures that are hurting their kids. The other piece that's really important is that teachers are not just harming Native kids with those misrepresentations. They're harming non-Native kids because those kids are being miseducated too. And they are, and the ripples from that are that those non-Native kids are going to grow up and they might be senators in Washington, D.C. who are passing laws that are going to impact the kids at Nambé Pueblo. And if they're passing those laws from a space of ignorance, that's harm on multiple levels. So so a lot of people think that if you don't have a Native kid in the classroom, it doesn't matter what you do. That is so wrong. It always matters.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I can say that I was definitely miseducated in my own upbringing. And I mean, I think it's really interesting, this idea of trust that you keep bringing up and reciprocal relationships, right? Because that is different than the way that a lot of non-Native people are brought up. So to infuse that into the education system through reciprocal research and accessibility and just community building through truth telling, I think is something that is invaluable and reverberates way throughout and outside of classrooms to have a real tangible impact on communities and society generally.
Yeah, and a piece of that that's unsettling as I observe what gets published over time are that the publishing industry wants the stereotypes because stereotypes sell. They want Native writers to spill their guts and talk about everything that we're not supposed to talk about, that we're taught not to talk about, that we're taught to protect. So what Native writers are sharing in the works that they're publishing are things that they know when to step back and not share. There are examples of writers who do not do that, and they end up being sanctioned and criticized. And some of them speak the community words, but don't live or walk the community words. Some of them aren't actually legitimate citizens or tribal members of the groups that they claim to represent. So it's interesting to see as the industry is taking a greater interest in publishing Native books, they just don't know what the body of work should be like, that in a way that reflects well upon the concerns of a given nation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, stereotypes sell, like you said, right? So do you see that as the biggest challenge facing your field of study and the field of publishing?
I wouldn't say it's the greatest because there's just too much history of misrepresentation. So that is one. It is a fact that Native writers who are writing stories set in the present day, when they submit a manuscript to a publishing house, it will get rejected because it doesn't have enough Indian stuff in it. Because they do want dance and ceremony. And so the ripples and impact of what the mainstream expects and what publishers know will sell with regard to stereotyping is a real obstacle for Native writing. That's just one problem that is there for Native writers. And when teachers are willing to speak up and step up and use books by Native writers, they are touching that future. You know, there's those bumper stickers that kids teach. I mean, teachers teach, they touch the future. They do, and they can, but they got to do right by Native people, and they can do that when if they'll use Native books by Native writers. A really important data point in that is that publishers keep track of sales. And if you have a book by a Native writer that's not selling really well, and they have one by a non-Native writer that is selling well, and it's all just stereotypes, that's where they're going to put the money. Because they don't care about education, they care about the bottom line.
Right.
So if teachers are using books by Native writers, they're getting visibility and more people will buy them, and the publishers will take note of that. Long-term impact.
Dr. Martinez, you go ahead.
Yeah, just, you know, one of my favorite childhood memories was, you know, being in fourth grade and the teacher passing out the Scholastic book order forms. And, you know, and then taking it home to my parents and saying, you know, begging them, right? Hey, I want to get this book and I have $5 or $8 or, you know, work it off my chore money, whatever that the case may be. But, you know, that was a moment, the excitement of getting the Scholastic book orders. Kids love that, look forward to that. I have a sixth grader, and that practice is still done today in the schools of how these book ordering forms get distributed. And it speaks to the point that you raised of what is actually included in those book forms. So, you know, what's your experience with Scholastic and, you know, kind of the industry, or, you know, if you want to just expand on that point.
Scholastic does have a reach into the educational market that nobody else has because of those little book ordering forms that kids bring home. And I got those. I grew up in the 60s, and I remember those. So it's got a long track record of being in the schools. It has gotten better over time. Scholastic still offers a lot of very problematic books, but they're also adding Native books to that. And they do some things that are just goofy as heck, but it's part of the ignorance that is just out there. Like they'll put a Native story, they'll call it a folk tale, and it's not a folk tale. It's, you know, it might be a creation story, but categorizing it as a folk tale in their catalog diminishes what that particular book means to the people who that story belongs to. So there's a lot that Scholastic could do to be better at what they're doing. They also have book fairs that are new. We didn't have book fairs when I was a kid. I don't know if you did, Dr. Martinez, but Scholastic vans would pull up and they just you know, set up tables that are full of books. Those also need a lot more diversity in them. It's interesting to look at a corporation like Scholastic and understand or learn that, well, the book fair people never talk to the catalog people, and the catalog people never talk to the diversity people. They're all in these little silos, and I'm thinking, well, you guys gotta talk to each other, because, you know, there's no reason to be in Minnesota and not have Birch Bark House in that catalog or on that table. There's no reason for that to happen. I'm talking about Birch Bark House, which is by Louise Erdrich, and it's set in Minnesota. It should be on every Scholastic flyer and on every book fair table.
Yeah, and I think that issue that you brought up of classification, you know, classifying things as folktales, that's an issue that we see in museums a lot too, right? Of things being categorized as folk art or ethnographic art or everything like that. And it's the same thing about bringing these larger academic conversations into public consciousness through something as simple as labeling, right? That people don't really think about, but those words really matter. And how people invest in those words and think through those words really can make an impact.
Yeah, the museums really have an important role. There are, you know, I was at NMAI a couple times in the last year and a half, and I go through the bookstore, and the store in Washington has done a much better job at getting rid of Paul Goebel. You know, Paul Goebel is in every museum bookstore. Paul Goebel's not Native. He says he was adopted by a Native person. Everybody thinks, okay, that means his books are good. Well, they're not. But he takes up a lot of shelf space. So museums need to really pay attention to what they're putting in their bookshops and not use Paul Global, but try to put books by Native writers in them. NMAI in DC is doing better. NMAI in New York needs to do a little bit better than they're currently doing.
So, I mean, thinking about all of this, where do you see the field moving? Are you optimistic? What excites you about maybe the future?
I am optimistic, partly because this year we saw the launch of an imprint. One of the major publishers decided to dedicate one of its lines to Native books, and that's called Heart Drum is the imprint, and it's HarperCollins, and their first books are coming out next year in 2021. So that's a huge, that we've never had that before, to have a major publisher commit that much staffing and time and energy and paper to Native people. So that's new. I'm excited about that. In recent years, the American Indian Library Association has been able to finally stand on that big stage. Every year, the American Library Association has an awards night, kind of like Oscars or something, when they pick all the best books in all these categories. And now the American Indian Library Association is able to be on that stage too. We've been giving book awards there for 15 or 20 years, and this is the first time we're on that big stage, and that matters. It's visibility. So that's another very good thing. Also, we are seeing more and more Native writers win those major awards from the American Library Association, so that's another plus. But it takes so much work and so many people. So I'm really glad that you've invited me here to be part of this series, and that you're going to have Native writers on this series talking about these books, because they matter and they need to be known more. They need to be more visible.
Matthew, do you have anything you want to jump in with?
You know, I just appreciate the notion that, you know, being mindful when we as parents or educators buy books, it's rooted in this acts of love, right? And so it's, the intention is good, it's well-meaning, and to support literacy is at the center of that act of love. And you know, it's really critical that we remember these acts can have ripple effects on who's reading, and who the publishers are, and how the industry is supported. But apart from that, you know, I reflect on my Sa'ya, all the ko'os, all the grandmothers, everybody who shared their stories. And you know, that's one of the beautiful elements of Indigenous culture, is we are people of stories. And so we've always been in that literary world, right? And so to think about it in print and children's books and literatures is kind of a new form to how we engage in these conversations. But I just always think it's important to reaffirm that we've always been a people of stories. And that's the richness that we have as Indigenous peoples. And you know, teachers and school districts are looking for these stories and in incredible ways. So I appreciate your insight, and really just having a platform of what is appropriate and what needs to be shared to the public.
Yeah, this is in the academy, in universities, that would be called critical Indigenous literacy. So that's one thing people can look for, is critical Indigenous literacy articles about that. But the thing that you said that I want to piggyback off of a little bit is, you used several Tewa words when you open this event. And just now, when you were talking about people in your community, Sa'yas and Ko'os and all. And that's a new development too in children's books. So we are seeing more books that have Indigenous languages in them. I have one here. It just came out. It's called When We Are Kind. And you see, this is all Navajo here. So this book throughout has Navajo language in it. And the illustrator is Nicole Neidhart, who is Navajo. And the writer, Monique Gray-Smith, is a First Nations writer who I can't think of her tribe just now. But anyway, we're seeing many, many books like that that have Indigenous languages in them. That's new. We're also seeing efforts to try and say, don't other our language, because what you often see in books is that English is in a regular font and then any other language is in italics. And that's a growing effort of activist writers and scholars and critics to say, quit putting non-English words in italics. It's just a font way of otherizing who we are. So that's cool too, to see publishers paying attention and not using italics for native words. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I've noticed a lot of journals have started doing that too in academia, which I think is a huge shift. I was working on something the other day, and it was specifically in the style guide that Indigenous words are not to be italicized, which I thought was hugely important. And then there was also something, Dr. Martinez, that I wanted to build off of. You said that Indigenous people have always been in the literary world, right? And that's absolutely true, but that goes against the mainstream stereotype notion, right, of people without history, of an idea of oral history and that versus written history. And I was wondering, Dr. Reese, if you could speak about that a little bit.
I get a little bristly about that word literary, because a lot of these words are ways that the academy and all the power structures diss people for the way that we speak, and they will dismiss writing that they don't think is literary enough. They will say, well, that's just socio-political writing. That's not literary. When it's a book that's really pushing hard on stereotyping and bias. Children's books do that. And so I guess I like to sit with that idea of telling stories. People across cultures tell stories about who they are, where they came from, what they hope to have for their communities, for their families. And that doesn't carry that white supremacy weight that the word literary does.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that,
go ahead.
That's how I think about that, is that it's so easy to fall into the allure of what is valued. And it's really white supremacy that's doing a trick with us.
Right, right. And that idea of storytelling is so powerful. And I mean, Linda Tooley-Smith, the Maori scholar in decolonizing methodologies, names storytelling as a distinctly decolonial project, right? And I think that's such an important thing to be able to sit with and think through the implications of what that actually can mean.
Sometimes when I think about the printed word or what we put on paper, I think about how people, academics in the United States have tried to say, oh, you guys didn't have written writing, you didn't have an alphabet, you just carved on rocks, like being dismissive of petroglyphs that are actually a form of communication.
Right.
And you just think about where we are right now. What are you going to do when we hang up and you get on this thing? You're going to use emoticons. Those are symbolic representations of a lot of meaning that we all share. People know what you're doing when you use those emoticons. A little kid in the backseat of the car driving down the highway sees the golden arches and know exactly what that means. So we are in a way, society is in a way really at odds with its dismissiveness of the ways that we have recorded knowledge.
So Dr. Reese, are you reading anything right now that you would like to share with MIAC audiences?
Yeah, actually, part of what I see when I study this body of Native writers is that I think we are tending to see more books by Native writers that are set in suburbs, which is really good because we have a lot of Native kids growing up in the suburbs across the country. But we also need the books that are set on reservations. And so I do really like this one. This is called Apple Skin to the Core. And the book that came out doesn't have this black trim around it. The actual book, this is the cover. This is an advanced copy that I got because asked the publisher to send me an advance copy. So this is by Eric Gansworth. It's called Apple Skin to the Core. Gansworth grew up on a reservation. His experience is a reservation existence. He's Onondaga, so he's up in New York. And when I read his stories, and he talks about his grandparents and great-grandparents at Carlisle and at boarding school, and the effect that had on them, and the ways that they were trying to work around that when they came home, and the impacts on language and understandings and all of that, that's what, it resonates with me because that's my history too. Though Gansworth is in New York and I grew up in New Mexico, we do share that reservation-based experience. So I really like his writings for that reason, and this book just came out last month, or actually no, it's this month. We're still in October. It just came out. So I really like that a lot. I really like that a lot. He also has a lot of humor in there, like, you know, we do a lot of teasing and a lot of nicknaming and stuff like that on the reservation, and that's all part of the book.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I'll definitely keep an eye out. Is there anything else you'd like to chat about right now?
Yeah, I guess so. As we move into Thanksgiving, teachers are pulling out all those dreadful worksheets and they're getting sent home. And I've had many parents already writing to me about the things they're getting sent home with their kids. Use that social media to say, hey, this is not right. Take pictures of those things and put them on social media and draw attention to them. So many books in the last few years have been withdrawn or stopped the presses because people said, you know, this isn't okay. And publishers don't want bad publicity. They really don't, especially now when monuments are coming down and people's awareness of all the peoples of these lands is growing. These guys are money makers and they're paying attention. And so use social media to call attention to problematic Thanksgiving worksheets that your kids are bringing home, because it was not a happy time. A fifth grader once wrote to me and said, you mean all those smiling worksheets that I did of Indians were wrong? And that was a statement from a fifth grader who was saying, my teachers did that to me. My teachers gave me these things, and they're not true. So that's where I come back to that trust that we have in teachers. And that kid will never forget that those teachers she had in first, second, third, and fourth grade gave her those materials.
And with Halloween too, right?
Yes.
And just what Dr. Martinez said, just making sure that your actions are rooted in love and reciprocal relationships, right? So I think we're all set. So everyone, thank you for joining us for our first installment. And Dr. Reese, a special thank you to you for kicking us off. This has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Kunta.